So before we use the Jupyter notebooks to do interpretation and inversion, we need to place a copy of these files in a location that the notebooks will be able to find. So if you remember, we have downloaded a folder that has all of the Jupyter notebooks, and we're going to go find this folder now. So I go to the location that has this GWB DC inversions. This is where I decided to go and unzip the file. And we see there are notebooks and tests. This is the contents of the thing you downloaded from GitHub. We had a video about this. And if you click notebooks, this is the location of all the Jupyter notebooks. So these are all just a bunch of files. So if I want these notebooks to be able to find the data files, I need to make a copy of them. So I need to make a copy of the data file, and I will need to put this in 2D data. And then I will need to go back, and I will need to make a copy of the topography and place the copy in this topography folder. So now when I open the notebook will be able to go and find this copy of the data. Now that we have placed these copies in the correct folders, we can start the Jupyter notebooks. To do this, we will click on the Windows icon and we will type Anaconda, and we will see this program, Anaconda Prompt. This is something that is available to you if you have installed the Anaconda package correctly. So we click this, and we see this command prompt here. And we will need to go to the place in the computer where you have your notebooks. So right now I am in C, users Devon, and I need to get to this place. And there's a very simple command. We type C, D, and then a space. This means change directory. And then I will click here and I will copy. And when I use the right click, this is the path to where my notebooks are. So I type C, D, space, and then the full location of where my notebooks are, and I press enter. And as you can see, I am in this directory. Just to show you what I mean, I'm going to type a command that tells me all of the files that are here. And you will notice, if you read all of these files, all of the names, they are the same names that are showing up here. I am just doing this to tell you that right now in this box, I am in the same place in my computer as this. So if you are here and you see the notebooks, you can launch the Jupyter notebooks by just typing Jupyter notebook. You press enter, and the notebooks will now show up. So to invert 2D DC resistivity data, we are going to use the DC 2D inversion app. So we have opened the notebook, and I will give you some instructions for how to use basic commands. So this is called a cell. Each one of these boxes is called a cell. And some of them just have words inside, and some of them have pieces of code. So these are instructions for things you would like the app to do. And to run one of these cells, you hold the Shift button and press Enter. So we see the little star means that the computer is trying to work, and when the number shows up, the task is finished. So this cell is telling the computer, I would like to import or bring in all of the tools that I need to run the rest of the app. And if you do the same process on any of the cells that have words, then it will just continue along. So this next cell is going to load your observed data. So you will hold down Shift and press Enter. And now we can choose a few things. We can choose a file name, topography if it exists, and whether or not the data are in the CSV format or the UBC format. So the data that we output from the Process2 program is UBC data. The file name that we had is the one at the bottom here, right? We made a copy of this file and we put it in the 2D data folder. And we made a copy of the topography file and we put it in that topography folder. So just to show you what I mean, so here's where all the notebooks live. I made a copy of that data file and I put it here. So this is why I'm able to find the file with this drop-down menu. If I didn't make a copy and place it in the correct folder, I would not be able to load this into the notebook. So the printout tells me that this data were loaded. It tells me it is a dipole-dipole survey, tells me the number of data, and some other information. So after I have loaded the data, the next thing that I need to do is I would like to plot the data. I would actually like to look at the data. And this is showing me the data on a pseudo section in terms of apparent resistivities. So it is always good to actually look at this instead of moving right away to inversion, because we can get some good information. One thing we see is the range of apparent resistivities. So the lowest apparent resistivity is around 85 ohm meters, and the highest is near 1,400 ohm meters. We can see that near the surface, especially on the right hand side here, we have a higher resistivity surface. We can see that there is some lower resistivity at depth, just below the surface. So maybe in the data we can see some patterns and we can infer some things about the resistivity structure of the Earth. We can't make a very detailed interpretation, but it is good to learn some things about the data. Some of the other controls we have is we could plot the data in terms of the actual voltage that was measured. And we can see the voltage measured is lower as we are measuring deeper, because the currents are going to be weaker when the electrodes are much further away. So this makes sense. We could also look at the histograms for, and in terms of how many are in each bin, so we can bin the different values. But usually you can look at the pseudo section. This control just changes the size of the plot if you want to make some changes in that way. Now that we have plotted our data, we can design the mesh. So the mesh is a numerical grid that we solve our math equations on. And when we do this, we have a bit of a compromise. If we make the cells very small, then we solve all of the math very accurately. But if we make the cells too small, then there are a lot of cells inside our mesh, and the computer does not have enough memory to solve the problem. So we need to think about this compromise. And the parameters we can change for our mesh is the horizontal size, the vertical size of our cells, the depth that we think most of the currents are, so kind of our depth of interest, and then how much padding we would like to use, how many padding cells. Because we would need we need to go and define this mesh to contain all of the currents. So at the edges, we need to know that the currents are 0. So we can run this cell, and we now have the options to change. And so a good choice for the width is based on the electrode spacing. So for this particular data set, I had an electrode spacing of 8 meters. And so the value of dx should be, the smallest, at smallest should be 1/4, or maybe 40 to 50%. So if I want to, if my electrode spacing is 8 meters, then maybe I want to use a 2-meter width. And if I want to solve the problem quicker, but maybe a little less accurate, I could choose to do a 4-meter width. So I will try that first. It is very common to make dz be the same as dx, to make square cells. And then as far as the core length, well, how deep do I think I'm really seeing? I think in this area, my dipole survey, for the most part, I think I'm going to get good information up to maybe 100 meters. So that is where I will put my maximum core depth. And now we talk about the padding. And a good estimate for the padding, I have usually put 15 here. But it seems to be successful when the padding is at least the same length as your survey line. So I have a survey line that is about 600 meters long, and so I've got a padding that is at least 600 meters long this way and 600 meters this way. So this is a good set of rules. And now I can see how many cells I have in this mesh by running this cell. So I have 7,120 cells in this mesh. The next step is to set the uncertainties. The uncertainties are an estimate of the level of noise on your data. So if my data are very noisy, then I need to assign larger uncertainties to my data. And if I think my data values are very accurate, I would assign smaller uncertainties. So for DC resistivity data, a very basic way is to assign a percent and a very small floor. In general, the dipole-dipole data are more noisy than Wenner-Schlumberger data because the currents are weaker. But for these types of surveys, both Wenner-Schlumberger and dipole-dipole, it's good to pick a percent between 2 and 10%, and a floor value can be something that is much, much smaller than 1. So for this example, I will choose a percent of 8. This is just my initial guess. I don't know what the true level of noise is, but I'm going to estimate it as 8, and I will be able to go and check if this was a good estimate. And for a floor, I will put 10 to the minus 6. So this readout has now told me I've applied an 8% floor and 10 to the minus 6. So you may have chosen 5 or 3%. I'm choosing 8 here. This may be a good starting point if you're using dipole-dipole. And now we have set the uncertainties. The final thing we need to do before running the inversion is to set the parameters. So there are many parameters here. The first thing is we need an initial resistivity model. So this is our first guess for the general resistivity of the area. And then we have a reference resistivity model. So during the inversion, we will try to explain the data, but we also would like to keep any structures that are the same as the reference model. We also have these alpha parameters, alpha s, alpha x, and alpha z. Alpha s will control how much the inversion would want to be similar to the reference model. If alpha x is large, it will tell us how smooth we want the recovered model to be horizontally. So if alpha x is quite large, we would try to be recovering layered structures. And if alpha z is large, then we would be trying to recover very vertically smooth structures. The max number of iterations, this is how many times the program will lower this beta and try and recover a model that fits the data better. So how many times will we go and find a solution? This is how many points you will use to define this Tikhonov curve. And the chi factor is setting the target misfit. So in this case, the notebook will autofill. It will give you a good set of parameters, and it will set the starting model and reference model to sort of the average apparent resistivity that you had in your data. So the data showed the resistivity of the area is somewhere near 200 ohm meters. In this case, it is 193 ohm meters. And it is set alpha s to 0.1 as a default value. And alpha x and alpha z are the same. So it wants to be just as smooth in the x and in the y, or sorry, in the x and in the z. And the inversion will run for 10 different betas. And we will have this chi factor. In this case, I will put this to 0.5. The reason I am doing this is because I don't know what my uncertainties are. And there is a chance that I've overestimated my uncertainties. Maybe 8% is too large. And the inversion will stop before I get a solution that adequately fits the data. So by doing this, I can make the curve, I can find some more solutions and really see the point where I'm fitting my data accurately without trying to fit the noise. Another thing I will do right now is I'm going to lower the alpha S. I'm going to make this quite small. And as a first attempt to doing inversion, this is not always a bad idea. What I'm doing is I'm telling the inversion that I don't really trust my reference model yet. So I'm just going to try and find a smooth model that explains the data. All of the things that I've done up until this point have really been a very basic way to get a first and easy inversion result. And we are going to examine the results and then decide if we can do better. So once I have set this initial set of inversion parameters, I'm going to click the Run button, and the inversion will begin. If I want to check to see how much memory my computer is using, I can press the Control, Alt, and Delete button at the same time and open the Task Manager. And it will tell me how much memory my computer is using. So I'm running the inversion, and Python is using quite a bit of memory. And right now I chose a small mesh so that I could run the problem quite quickly, but also that it would not take up a lot of my memory. So right now, 50% of my computer's memory is being used. If this number ever gets to be 100%, then the inversion will stop because the computer does not have enough space to remember all the numbers. We will show the effects of this when we run another inversion. So for now, I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to wait for the inversion to finish, and then we will come back and look at the results. So after some time, we see that the inversion algorithm has reached the target misfit. So at first, we have a large beta, and phi d, the data misfit, is very large. This is a resistivity model that has a lot of structure but does not explain the data very well. And as we lower the beta, we see that phi d becomes lower. We are recovering models that explain the data better and better. So we can see the convergence here. Now, if we want to visualize this, and we want to see the results of the inversion, we run this cell, and the first thing that will show up is our misfit curve. So this is, if we had set the chi factor equal to 1, this is where the inversion would stop if we assumed we had made a proper estimate of our noise, if we had applied the correct uncertainties. But we see that it's below this value before the curve starts to flatten out. So maybe our estimate of the uncertainties was a little bit too high. And so we can see the convergence here. Right, we're lowering beta, we're getting models that are explaining the data better and better. And so maybe we want to look at the 6th or the 7th iteration. This is where the curve is starting to flatten out. These are solutions that are explaining the data most likely, but are not explaining the noise. So we can now go look at iteration 6 or 7. So this is the curve. We could also have looked at this as the Tikhonov curve if we wanted to. We could have plotted this on a log-log scale. So the next thing we would look at is the data misfit. We click this to see the data misfit. And here is our observed data. This is our predicted data. And this is the misfit. So we can see that for the most part, this model that we have is explaining the data fairly well. And it's explaining the data fairly equally in most areas. And we could look at this comparison at different iterations, right? So maybe if we wanted to go and look at iteration 2, this is a place where we don't really explain the data very well. We sort of get some of the structures, but these misfits are very large. And you can see that this area here in the predicted data doesn't match this area here in the observed data. Okay? So things that use the high beta, things that are at the beginning of your convergence curve are not going to explain the data very well. And as we continue, we get solutions that explain the data better and better. And so now we could look at the model. We could say that we think we are explaining the data fairly well at iteration 7 without explaining the noise. And we look at the model, and we have this minimum and maximum, and so we can change the range of values that we would like to plot. So I think maybe I would like to have the minimum resistivity be 30 and the largest resistivity be 1500, because I think this is the range of values that I would be seeing in the area. So you can adjust this if you would like to. You could plot the grid if you wanted to. And so we see that we have this near surface region of high resistivity. Below that, we seem to have some lower resistivity here, but the left side has the very big low resistivity structure. So this was just the process to go through a first pass of inversion. Recall that we did not use a very fine mesh. We used the biggest cells that we were allowed to use. We had an initial guess at our uncertainties, but we really didn't know the level of noise. And we picked a model that was going to be the smoothest, or a smooth recovered model. So we know that there is this area of low resistivity here, and we know that it is highly resistive near the surface, but we don't really know what is the depth to this low resistivity region. It seems to be anywhere between 25 and even 50 meters. So this is a very broad or not very detailed recovered model. Maybe we get a general understanding of what is under the Earth, but we are not maybe ready to make our final interpretation. But now that we've gone through this process and we understand the tools, we're going to try and do a better job. We're going to use the things that we learned in this fast inversion, this smooth inversion, and we're going to try to do a better job. Okay? So another thing that we learned before we start again is that our initial estimate of the background resistivity actually seems pretty reasonable. maybe it is a little bit lower. So maybe the initial resistivity is more like, 250 or something like that. We could also zoom out and not just look at the core region. So yeah, the background seems to maybe be a little bit more resistive. And so now that we know this, we're going to do another inversion. So to try again, we're going to need to restart the notebook. You can do this at any time. If you make a mistake or maybe you cause some kind of problem and you would like to start from the very beginning, at any time you can go to Kernel and you can choose Restart or Restart and Clear Output and click OK. And now you see that none of the cells have been run. It is like you've never used the program. So we will go through the same steps as before, and I will go through a little bit quicker now. So we import all of the packages that we need. We're going to load the same observed data in its UBC format. We could plot and look at the data again. And our first change is going to be with the mesh. So we used 4-meter cells last time. This time we're going to use, we will try to use maybe 2-meter cells. And we will still go to 100 meters. Okay. So now the cells are twice, or sorry, they're 1/2 of the size. I now have 4 cells for each electrode width, right? The electrode spacing was 8 meters. I'm now using 2-meter cells. This gives me 20,800. Last time I had a little bit over 7,000 cells. So I will solve the problem more accurately, but it will take longer. We saw that if I want my best model, if I want to have my inversion stop at a chi factor of 1, I need to have smaller uncertainties, right? I saw that my curve, my convergence curve, only started to flatten out when I was my data misfit was smaller than the number of data, that horizontal dashed line. So I'm actually going to decrease the uncertainty. I'm going to make it 6% instead of 8%, but I will add the same floor. So now I'm saying I think that the noise on my data is a little bit lower. And now I will start for looking at the inversion app. And so when I zoomed out and I looked at my recovered model, I started to think that maybe I have underestimated my background resistivity. So instead of choosing the default, I'm going to now choose 300 ohm meters. I'm going to make the background a little bit more resistive. And I'm going to trust my reference model a little bit more. So I've got a larger value of alpha S, right? I made this very small for my first attempt. I just said, give me back a smooth model and don't trust the reference model very much. But now I think I'm trusting the reference model a little bit more. So I'm going to leave this default value. I'm going to do a few extra beta iterations just in case. And I'm still going to put a chi factor that is below 1, just on the off chance that I have still overestimated my uncertainties. And now we're going to pause for a moment. Okay, so now we are ready to run the inversion. So I am trying to solve a bigger problem, and right now I have 37% of my computer's memory running things on my computer, and I'm going to start the inversion now. We can see now that we're trying to solve the problem, and the memory being used is quite large. So this is much bigger than the problem we tried to solve before. And so I just wanted to show that a lot more of the computer power is needed to solve this. So I'm going to pause the video, and then I'm going to return when the inversion is finished. All right, so the inversion is now completed, and we see that we do reach target misfit, but much later, because our uncertainties are lower. So we can go look at the convergence curve once again. See, and now the location where the curve starts to flatten out is near this dashed line. This is where the inversion would have stopped around at iteration 10 if I had set the chi factor equal to 1. So this means that overall, this is actually a good estimate of my uncertainties. Okay? So if you have a good estimate of your uncertainties, then this dashed line is going to be somewhere kind of where your convergent curve starts to flatten out. So let's go look at the data misfit for iteration 10. Okay, so now we're doing a very good job at explaining the data. We have most of the features in the observed data set show up in the predicted data, and we can see that these normalized misfits, they're not sort of, they're a little bit bigger over here than they are over here, but and a little bit larger here. But these look to be fairly good. So if we like that model in terms of its data misfit, we can finally go and look at the recovered model. So we'll set the maximum and the minimum to be a range that is more reasonable. And this is the result that we have. So maybe we could look at iteration 9. So it's we see that there is a very low resistivity region here that is about 20 or 25 meters depth, and then it's a little bit lower, and then we see that this layer or region of lower resistivity is also showing up on the other side, and we see the higher resistivity at the near surface. And if we go and we look at the whole area and not just the core region, then we see that we did a much better job of estimating what the background resistivity was. There isn't sort of a different color here and then transitioning to different colors before starting to see this feature. So this seems to be a pretty good background. So this is a much better result we have than our first attempt at inversion. And from here, we should be able to do an interpretation and assess whether or not there is a region that might be an aquifer. So hopefully you found this to be useful, and I hope that you choose to look at the convergence curve. So look at the curve first, then start to think about which iteration you are fitting the data sufficiently, what is a good model, then start to look at the data misfit, and finally start to look at the recovered model. Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about inverting 2D data with Jupyter notebooks. So you are going to start with the data files you create with ProSys2, and we are going to take those data, we are going to load them into the Jupyter notebook, and in the end we will have a 2D inversion of Wenner-Schlumberger data or dipole-dipole data. So what we first need to do is we need to find the data files that were output from ProSys2. So there are two files you should have. One will be the actual data, and we can open this up. So this has been output from ProSys2. We have the horizontal position of the A, B, and MN electrodes, and we have the voltage that was measured. And we also have the topography. So for many of the surveys that we did, we had flat topography. We assumed that the Earth was flat, but if there were some hills or this was included in our ProSys2 data processing, we would see some different numbers here. So this is what we need to start with.